This evening, we are very lucky to be able to hear from Dr. Catharine Copass. She's an ecologist and a former staff member of the North Coast and Cascades North Coast and Cascades Inventory and Monitoring Network with the National Park Service was based here at Olympic National Park. And she is no longer with the National Park Service, but she is still in Port Angeles. And so we're very grateful that she would take her time to come and talk about some of the work that she did while she was on staff at the Inventory and Monitoring Network. So I will now turn the time over to Kath. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Dean, for that great introduction. And as Dean said, I enjoyed a 16-year career with the Park Service as the coordinator for the park's Vegetation Classification and Inventory Monitoring project, and that's what I'm here to share with you tonight. Let's see, moving forward. Sorry. So as many things in the federal government, this project actually started with an act of Congress called the Natural Resource Challenge that created funding for the national parks to create a set of baseline inventories of important natural resources, of which our vegetation resources are one. So the goals of my project were to both describe and classify the broad range of plant communities found in Olympic National Park, actually in all the national parks in Washington State. But tonight I'm just going to talk about the work at Olympic. And then to build accurate and new vegetation maps of these vegetation communities. The maps that we had been working with at the time were 10 to 15 years old and had, although they had been developed with the state-of-the-art remote sensing techniques of the time, they weren't proving to be useful in many applications. So it was time for a refresh. And of course, participating in government science, an important charge is to create data and results that are available to the public. And then a part that was very important to me personally was the opportunity to train and mentor a lot of young field biologists and botanists. So just to kind of set the stage for some the context of thinking about vegetation patterns, not only Olympic, but all over. We think of plant species as occurring in what we might call an envelope, which reflects each species' requirements for or tolerances of environmental conditions. And in addition to that is kind of a time component or a biology component about how those species both arrive and persist on the landscape. So in a very simple fashion, we can think of our envelope as having elements of elevation, climate factors, maximum and minimum average temperatures, same for precipitation, the maximum or minimum precipitation, disturbances that wipe out entire groups of plants, soil characteristics that also interact with moisture to determine water availability to the plants, and then of course the dispersal and reproduction characteristics of the plant species themselves. There's more to these climate envelopes, but this is kind of the very basics: temperature, elevation, environmental conditions. So on the Olympic Peninsula, I think we've all experienced that we have some very interesting climate patterns that are derived from our unique topography. So we have an extreme precipitation gradient with a very strong rain shadow effect that goes from the southwest to the northeast. This picture is of precipitation in the park, but it also outlines the elevation and the topography patterns of the park with a very flat coastal plain at sea level, moving up very rapidly to the tall mountains in the middle of the peninsula. And those precipitation and elevation and temperature all interact to create very strong climate gradients. And of course, some of that precipitation falls as snow. So depending on the elevation too, we have water availability to plants that's very dependent on the time of year, with a can be a very deep snowpack. Lots of factors in our climate envelope here. And of course, these climate patterns, I'm going to move something on my screen. These climate patterns create the envelopes that I mentioned earlier, leading plant species to occur somewhat predictably across the landscapes, and also in groups that tend to repeat together. So we call these groups of repeated species plant communities or plant associations. And one of the goals of the work was to identify and describe as many of them as we could. So fortunately for us, there is an existing system, a classification system for plant communities that's actually pretty similar to the Linnaean system that we use to classify species. So this is a national system that follows a hierarchy from very coarse levels at the plant physiognomic level, so forests versus woodlands, shrublands, that moves down in levels of detail to the lower levels, which is where the bulk of our work was focused. So these are plant alliances and associations that reflect the dominant tree species or canopy species and an indicator understory species. So the classification system is actually important because it's shared among all the federal agencies and actually the state agencies as well. So as you can imagine on the peninsula, the park surrounded by the Forest Service and DNR lands. Fortunately for us, we have a system that moves across these arbitrary jurisdictional boundaries. So how do you create a vegetation classification? Well, kind of lucky for us, we get to go out the field day after day and collect a lot of data. So the vegetation classification is built off inventory data that's collected in homogeneous areas of vegetation. And an inventory plot typically collect plant species data and cover, describe the canopy structure, record some information about the environmental setting, take a picture. Sometimes we would do some soil characteristics measurements too. And because of how big the park is and how hard it is to get to some of these places in the park, we actually picked random points that were generally within 500 meters of a trail or route. And that doesn't sound like very far, but I can tell you it once took me 4 hours to go 250 meters to a plot along the coastal strip. It can be pretty challenging to get that far off trail in the park, and it certainly makes you appreciate the value of our trail system. So the classification was summarized in a report that was developed by the Washington Natural Heritage Program and includes descriptions for over 300 plant associations. And we really tried to maximize the commonalities between the three big parks. So the mapping report and also the classification report really focuses on the core associations that are shared, but of course, each park has its own unique associations that are only found in those parks. Another important component of this report was that we were able to draw on Park Service funding to help really flesh out descriptions of wetland communities and leverage some work that the Heritage Program was doing to describe these really important components of our ecosystems. So the classification report has a very standard format, which gives a picture of each association, describes where it is in the classification hierarchy, the range, for example, is it found only in the Olympics or is it found all over, and a brief description. But another really important component of the classification system is something that's called the conservation status rank. So this is a ranking system that has 5 being least imperiled to a ranking of either both global or state ranking of 1, which means that that plant association is critically imperiled, meaning generally there's very few known locations. The plots it occurs in, the patches it occurs in may be very small sizes, may be restricted to very unique landscape features or be at risk of extirpation from land use conversion and land use change like logging. So that rank justification is a really important description of why the type has the conservation rank. I'll be talking quite a bit more about that later on. Okay, so then we took our vegetation classification built off of thousands of plot data points, over 2,000 from Olympic National Park alone. And honestly, I could probably do another whole hour talk on how we actually made the vegetation maps. And if I just wave my magic wand and say, poof, we made maps, then I'll have kind of erased 4 very stressful years of my life. So I've distilled it down to one kind of basic slide. The basic steps was that we took our vegetation classification and then we developed map classes that kind of continued to roll that detailed association information up to more broad classes. And we combined the plot data with a bathtub full of different kinds of remotely sensed environmental data. Again, thinking about those climate envelopes, we know that there's relationships between landscape position and elevation, precipitation, climate conditions, and these plant species or associations. And so we leveraged what we knew about those relationships to train computer models to predict, to take kind of what we knew from each point by point to create a model that we could then extrapolate across the entire park landscape using that remotely sensed data. This picture kind of shows one of the many, one of the pieces of modeling magic that we used was, this graphic kind of shows a computer probability scheme, which would help the models determine which map class to assign to a certain point. You can see it's more probable in one landscape position versus another. So it's rolling in that environmental data. So the basic building block of the maps is a 3-meter pixel, which we combined into our smallest map units, 3 pixels on a side, so a 9 by 9 meter pixel. And the average map unit in the maps I'm going to show you is approximately 20 meters on a side. So that's a very high resolution for this kind of information. And we also used statistical methods to assess how accurate the maps are, or how good of a job we did. And although I know 84% sounds kind of like a B grade, it's actually, in the mapping world, that's kind of like an A+. These maps are not only at an unprecedented resolution, but we really kind of knocked it out of the park in terms of how accurate they are. So this is the map that we made. We did spend a lot of time developing a color scheme that links similar map classes visually, while also being able to help discern some of the map types that occur on much smaller scales. And so as you look at the map, you can kind of see shifts in the dominant colors and the map classes they portray. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time digging into some of these map classes and showing you what they represent. So our tour kind of starts, I'll go roughly from west to east and from low elevation to high elevation, but I'll jump around a little bit, to be honest. But starting on the coast, we have in that kind of really dark green, a narrow strip of, coastal forests that are dominated by Sitka spruce. This is actually the north end of Lake Ozette is the blue bit, and that's the Ozette River that's goes out to the coast. So people often ask, like, oh, what was the most surprising thing that you learned from your mapping project, which is always kind of a fun question to contemplate. And for me, one of the kind of hit me over the head a little bit of unsurprising results was that our coastal forests are almost all state rare types. And you can see I've clipped out 2 of the association descriptions, and they actually have a conservation rank of GNR, which means they're not currently ranked globally, but they're thought to be state rare. So if you think about Washington State, quite a bit of the coast is already in the park, and not that much of the coast is outside the park. But what is outside the park is all in private ownership, most of it. So we have a really important role in terms of conserving these rare forest types. So moving inland a little bit, that kind of olive drab army color is a CO1. This is a red cedar, western hemlock, and salal type. Now the picture I'm showing is one of the broadest areas that we have within the wilderness coastal strip, and it is dominated by that red cedar type. But interestingly, those coastal forests, even within that broad expanse, are also state rare types, meaning they're critically imperiled at the state level. So these are pretty lush forests. Again, I mentioned it taking 2 hours to go a few hundred meters through these forests. These are beautiful, dense forests with very thick, thick shrub layers. And then lastly, just a little piece of this map. Those maroon patches are what's sometimes known as the coastal prairies, which are bogs and fens, which have a really unique combination of wetland, sedge types, sphagnum mosses, and then sometimes with low shrubs and red cedars. And I don't think it's going to surprise you to find out that those coastal bogs and fens are also a state rare, state imperiled type. So moving through some more of the forested map classes. Again, our previous map had about 1 to 2 map classes for each of these forest zones. And it was really one of our goals to try to tease out some of the differences that we knew were on the landscape in terms of these plant associations that often have the same overstory species, but very different understory species, which means when you use remote sensing tools, you don't have a lot to work with, because the overstory is remotely sensed from above. It looks pretty similar across a lot of these types, but there are very significant differences in the understory. So this is where we really have to use all that wealth of plot data and combined with environmental modeling to try to tease out some of these differences as best we could. And it was in the montane silver fir zone actually where a lot of our inaccuracy, where our accuracy problems came from, because although we tried really hard to tease apart some of these types, it was just we didn't have enough data. It was just more than we could accomplish in this project, but we certainly tried. So looking at some of these patterns in the map, and then also kind of juxtaposing pictures from the classification, we have a pretty typical pattern along all the western riparian zone. So the little snippet from the map is showing you a piece of road adjacent to one of the lowland rivers. I'm not sure which one. And these rivers have very wet hemlock and Douglas-fir dominated forests, which kind of move into slightly drier types as you move away from the floodplain and move upslope slightly. So in any given watershed, they kind of follow the elevation patterns with forests that kind of decrease in their moisture levels as you move uphill. And one of the other interesting outcomes, so this is a picture of a forest type of that CO6 western hemlock, slightly uphill type, covers a lot of real estate in the park. But one of the other challenges we had was that a lot of acres of this forest type actually don't have much of an understory. So our classification system and our maps too were built on needing to know what the understory vascular species were. And this kind of constantly threw a wrench in the works, because there weren't enough plants to work into the modeling systems that we used, which it reflects a couple of different things. One, different kinds of disturbance histories from very intense fires that create an understory, that create a regeneration pattern that really reduces the amount of light available to plants. That's one of the possibilities, but there may be other things going on. I always picture underground warfare with mycorrhizae and sort of the biochemical warfare or cooperation that plants have in the soil layer. So we don't actually know a lot about, but there's something that goes on that keeps, mostly light probably, that keeps the understory from being very abundant in a lot of these areas. And then again, unique and really special to Olympic are these dry Douglas-fir forests. This picture is the Elwha. You can see the Griffburn is that kind of brown patch. So this is the lower reaches of the Elwha, inside and outside the park. And that light olive color and that kind of weird mustard color are 2 dry Douglas-fir dominated forest types that are very prevalent in the Elwha, but actually not very common elsewhere on the landscape or in the Northwest. So these rain shadow forests, you can see a conservation ranking of S2. So these are, because of how restricted they are to this rainforest zone, they're not particularly widespread, and they're really unique and to our area. Even though, of course, we hike in them a fair amount, they feel kind of ubiquitous, but they're pretty special. Okay, so here's another thing that I hadn't really thought about before this mapping project, but we think about Olympic National Park as 3 parks in one, right? The coastal strip, the rainforest, the Hoh, and the subalpine meadows. But what colors do you actually see the most of on this map? It's the blue, greens, and kind of light teals that really dominate the map. And we ran this is a visual way to look at the dominance of the different map classes within the map. And of course, the top 4 classes in the map are all forests that are dominated by silver fir. Of course, nobody comes to Olympic National Park to hike our beautiful silver fir forests, right? It's like it's somewhere that you kind of try to hike through when you're trying to get somewhere maybe a little bit nicer with better views. But we did our best to pull apart a handful of different silver fir classes that span different moisture zones, so very moist to very dry, and have different combinations of either at the lower elevations, they're very often with western hemlock as a co-dominant, and then moving upslope into the higher elevation areas, the silver fir is typically found with subalpine fir or mountain hemlock. And here's yet another one of those like, huh? So one of the silver fir types is actually, again, a state rare type. It's one of the silver firs. Again, if you read the description, it has blueberry, Alaska blueberries, and has deer ferns, which suggests that it's found. The deer fern suggests it's found in pretty moist locations. So I think because of its fidelity to the more moist pockets within the silver fir zone, it's actually a state rare type. So moving up in elevation to the subalpine forest, this little map snippet is actually the low divide. So coming up out of the Quinault, the little green zone, over low divide, you can see the lakes that are part of Martin's Park, Mary Margaret, I think the names are, and then into the Elwha would be in the upper right corner. So subalpine fir forests and also mountain hemlock fir forests. Both types can be found with our kind of iconic heather understories. And then some other map classes I really wanted to share are forests that go from successional, primary succession on gravel bars. Broadleaf forests originate in those zones, and depending on river dynamics, turn into broadleaf forests and then into conifer forests over time. And then adjacent in those same river zones, often these broadleaf riparian and swamp forests, dominated by alders and sometimes poplar or big leaf maple. And then another type we just have it here at Olympic was this coastal red alder forest, that light green color mapped along the coastline, which are these dynamic cliffs, basically steep slopes that go from the coastal terrace down to the water. Areas of pretty frequent disturbance where conifers can't persist due to the high disturbance rates. Another result of our project, kind of a strange one to be proud of, honestly, but before we started our classification work, we didn't actually have a lot of botanical information about avalanche chutes and talus fields and shrublands, because they're really not fun places to work. And thanks to my crew and their persistence across all 3 parks, we did a lot of sampling in these avalanche chutes and shrublands, and really expanded the classification, particularly at North Cascades, where there had been very little work done. But we were able to use that wealth of plot data to really map out Sitka alder shrublands versus vine maple shrublands, So the map really shows you those avalanche chutes that go from the upper elevations where it's snowy or shrubby, and then all the way down into the riparian zones. And then we did map some wetland types, at a very aggregated scale compared to the floristics, but our shrub dominated wetlands. This is one you may have been by. It's at the near the parking lot at the Ho Visitor Center. And then another a unique type I really wanted to point out are herbaceous balds. So the map snippet is actually just slightly outside the park. So that's Kelly Peak and the gooseneck and the balds that are both inside and outside the park. But there's quite a few more that you find further south in the Elwha into the park. And so balds are a landform and a vegetation type. They're exposed concave rocky areas that are the bedrock is too close to the surface to easily support the growth of trees. So they often have shrubs, low shrubs, or a lot of moss and occasionally some really beautiful wildflowers. We have a kind of a pocket of balds here in the Elwha area, and actually the staircase zone is another part of the map where we have quite a high density of balds in the map. So because they're just not found, I mean, the map looked like everything's bald. The little map snippet looked like there's a lot of balds, but actually they're also one of those landforms that we just don't have a lot of in the park. So the vegetation that's associated with them is also often state rare. So the little snippet on the left is one of the bald types that has plectritis and some other really beautiful spring wildflowers. And then the picture on the right is kind of a little bit more typical, low grasses and mosses. We mapped a lot of different herbaceous types, some that are unique to Olympic. And these are aggregations of a lot of different beautiful plant associations. One that's pretty common, this is the map snippet from Hurricane Ridge. You can see the visitor center in the parking lot. So those big open meadows right below and around the visitor center, mostly mapped as subalpine summer dry grass forb meadows, which is definitely a bit of a mouthful, but it reflects the fact that they're summer dry because they actually start the spring under snow and are quite moist. So they have a strange combination of plant species that are very tolerant to very moist conditions, but also can survive the fact that over the course of the summer they dry out significantly. So and then just pointing out some, we did map, again, very aggregated herbaceous wetlands and shrubby wetlands as well. And these are often found in very small patches in the higher elevation, but found all over the landscape where there's enough moisture through the growing season to sustain these plant species that need quite a bit of moisture. And then tucked within those herbaceous wetlands are snowbed communities, again, pointing out that these are ranked as critically imperiled, thinking about climate change and the potential significant changes in moisture availability related to snowpack. These communities are extremely vulnerable to climate change. So this is the point in the talk where I realized that I can't go through every single map class. And I have to kind of move away from going class by class, even though I would love to do that. So what I decided to do was put up a picture of, again, another part of the park that I think many of you may be familiar with. And the snaky line through the middle of that map snippet is the obstruction point road. And I guess I sort of started to think about this warm, sunny day, kind of like winter might actually eventually come to an end, and we'll start our hiking season up in upper elevation areas. And I guess I was just kind of hoping that this talk, seeing these map classes and thinking about the fine scale details that we were able to capture kind of with the magic of computer modeling may kind of inspire you to head out on your own scavenger hunt and see these patterns emerge and repeat as you explore various areas of the park. And so, just kind of looking at this overview of the park again and thinking that we've had a chance to dig through the classes a little bit, learn a little bit about these park resources, like maybe some different patterns are sticking out, or you're seeing some of the features a little bit differently. So Dean mentioned that that actually I worked my way out of my mapping job by finishing my maps, but it's been very gratifying to see my colleagues continue to use this information in a big variety of ways. One of the most important ways, actually, I don't have a good graphic for, but a very fine scale detailed vegetation map is super useful for wildland fuels mapping. In the case of a wildland fire in the park, these vegetation maps would be very useful for being able to both to map and predict fire behavior, because the vegetation classes are turned into fuel types, and there's a lot of information about how different fuel types behave. So that could be one future use of these maps. But in the meantime, they're being used for all kinds of different sampling projects, both looking for where or where not you might set up sampling plots if you're trying to target different community types or different plant species even. For example, the graphic from the middle is from a project looking at whitebark pine across the parks. And also, I think the wildlife folks are using the map for a variety of different habitat studies. The little snippet on the right is from the marmot project. So there's some of the marmot monitoring polygons, and I think they were looking at the vegetation correlation with the different, whether the patches are occupied by marmots currently or not. So there's just a couple of the fun examples. I think there's some more ways that the maps are getting used, which is pretty awesome to see. And then, we're certainly very fortunate. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on this one. We're certainly fortunate to have this national park and all the resources that it conserves inside. And I feel very lucky to have spent the bulk of my career helping to create the tools and data to help manage it. And of course, since my job ended, I've actually been working in land management and conservation topics outside the park boundary. And broadening the scope of my work has really allowed me to see something that may not be a new perspective to some of you, but it certainly was for me. And because the park is so large and it really dominates the center of the peninsula, it's hard not to feel like it kind of does the job in terms of conserving the important resources of the peninsula and creating kind of an island of resiliency in the face of climate change. But I think some of my work has highlighted to me that there are very, we've talked a lot about those state rare types that are only found along the coastal strip, because of the intense land transformations that have occurred between the coastal strip and the areas that the park actually covers. And so those areas that they kind of span those last remaining pockets of older or less disturbed forests that occur within those coastal lowland forest areas, I think they really play an outsized role. They maintain habitat connectivity from headwaters areas in the parks to downstream areas. And in doing so, they help protect stream temperatures. Those forest pockets, those few that exist, they really create some additional resiliency in the face of climate change. And I think those areas outside the park also really deserve some of our attention. And so my other kind of last thought is that I do think that the maps that we've made will be a very valuable tool in identifying and understanding vegetation changes that will occur due to our changing climate. And the patterns that we have documented so far have arisen during a time of relative climate stability, but I think we're aware that we're currently experiencing warming temperatures and changes in the timing and the amount of precipitation that may be quite a bit less predictable. So going back to our kind of understanding of plant species occurring in envelopes at the beginning, we can see that there may be uncertain futures for many species. And in areas that also have good vegetation inventory data and mapping data, scientists are beginning to track some of the mismatches that start to occur as climate change happens faster than the ability of plants to shift their distributions or adapt. So what's being seen in other areas are trees, for example, that are persisting in a new climate envelope where their trees and seedlings actually can no longer make it. And in these cases, standard replacing disturbances, particularly fire, can result in rapid conversion to other vegetation types. So I'm really hoping that, one of the goals for making these maps was to create a baseline picture of our vegetation resources so that we are able to understand and help maybe predict and help potentially develop some management plans related to some of the ways in which climate change will affect our vegetation resources. And I think with that, I've certainly covered enough, and I wanted to just mention I have a lot of people who work very hard for a lot of years on these projects with me, and I really always need to share my thanks for all the work that went into to putting this together. So I think with that, I can try to take some questions.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I really enjoyed your presentation, and you made it, yes, you made it sound easy, and I know it was anything but. From the field work to the work with the modeling and the mapping, what a monumental undertaking and effort. So, and I really appreciate you coming and sharing with us some of your work. We do have one question in the chat, and I'll encourage others to go ahead and ask their questions now. But Jeff Bowman, he wants to know what might have been accomplished by such a small 20-meter mapping resolution that might not otherwise have been realized, and was the tight resolution ultimately worth the effort?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I'd always pictured and when I first started this project, I had Kim Sager, who had finished her black bear project where she had radio collared black bears. I think other wildlife species, there's very high resolution data available now based on satellite radio collars for wildlife species. And so what I always pictured would happen with this high resolution data is that people would really finally be able to kind of crack some of the questions about why wildlife species use certain habitats over certain times of the year. And I don't know if that's happened yet, but I am glad that we have the high resolution data that could feed into that kind of a project, for example.
Awesome. Okay, here's another one from Jeff Bowman. He says, as a baseline, did this work happen soon enough to be a baseline for what has evolved here and been present for the past 200 to 300 years?
I think that's a good point. I think the answer is kind of just barely. And we do have, we're lucky compared to, we're, some of the evidence for the climate vegetation mismatch is coming quite a bit from California and other drier climates. And I think we can all appreciate that our climate is, more temperate, and we're not necessarily going to face that kind of rapid disruption so quickly. Hopefully, maybe never, but who knows? So I think our timing is okay.
Yeah, we hear stories of, saguaros or Joshua trees not growing in Joshua Tree National Park anymore like that. The area may not be conducive to that, and sequoia groves maybe with these huge fires that have been down in California, maybe not being able to regenerate. So yeah, those are concerns.
Yeah. And we're certainly seeing evidence right now that some of our iconic conifer species are experiencing summer after summer of drought stress. There's been the heat dome of 2 summers ago really was another significant stressor. So there's a lot of pieces that feel a little bit like they're on the verge of going in different directions, but I think it's too soon to tell.
Yeah. From Dan Newhouse, he is asking, is there a website or a resource where the public can explore the data and maps?
Yeah, that's a great question. So currently my understanding is all the data is available for download out of the Park Service's public data store. It's a thing called IRMA, IRMA, and that the veg maps, I don't think the park atlases have been made that would be able to show the veg maps, but I believe that's in the works.
Yeah, great. Emma, and I will do some more research on that and and I'll share that with Sarah so that we can at least get a web address so that you can access that. So I will work with Sarah to get that done. Emma is asking that you didn't mention madrone, and she's really interested in that. Is there do you have anything about madrone communities?
We don't have a specific map class that focuses on the madrone, although it is an important component in a lot of the dry Douglas-fir forests, that map class that I mentioned in the LWA. Yeah. It's funny. I was just trying to look up a plant association today that was a madrone type, and I couldn't track it through our process. I don't know if it got rolled into a Douglas-fir type, or if we just we didn't end up having enough of it specifically in the park to include in the classification.
Yeah, great. Just a thank you from Scott McGee. Very interesting and well done. So, and then here's a question from Todd A. He's asking, is there any infrared data that can be overlaid to see effects of geothermal?
Ooh,
that's interesting.
That is interesting. That I have no idea. I've never really thought about that. I mean, certainly the remote sensing data that we used did not include infrared. So I don't know if that would be available on a very broad scale at this point.
Yeah. All right. So that one is a stump the presenter one.
There's certainly a lot of people who have been on I don't know if this is related to the hunt for some of the lesser known hot springs in the park.
Yeah. Okay. Finding hot springs by plant communities. Okay. There is a question from Rosie and Fred, and thanks for your hard work and insight. Can you kindly comment on the role of indigenous peoples via prescribed fire, gathering and hunting, in maintaining and shaping habitats, especially coastal prairies and dry chaparral bald communities?
Yeah, I think there's certainly ample evidence that the open spaces on the prairie were maintained through fire, and I haven't seen as much research on it, but I would imagine certainly the balds in the shallow areas of the park, so more coastal adjacent, and along the straits. Something I actually thought about more since leaving the park. So the balds, and then the east-west trending ridges along Lake Crescent, Aurora Ridge, and all those that have increasingly experienced encroachment from trees in the current period, but are not hard to imagine that they were easily accessible and purposefully maintained by fire for target plant species. There's certainly bear grass up in some of those areas and other unique herbaceous plants.
Yeah.
I don't know if we have a lot of yeah, I would love to see someone explore that topic more thoroughly.
All right. Janice Berger, our former coworker, she asks, any insights into the future of white bark pine?
I might have to punt that one to any of the other the other Park Service botanists who may be on this Zoom. I haven't. I think there was some work related to listing it. That's what the graphic was showing, but I've not been tracking that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have any information to share on that, other than it is a huge concern about the persistence of those trees. There's not very many of them here in Olympic, are there?
No.
So, but there are more in the Cascades, and they're not doing well. So, yeah. Is there anyone on the line who would like to unmute themselves and answer if they know more about that?
I could probably speak to that. This is Janet Coles. I'm under Kath Kersey's blog on, but yeah.
So for everyone who's listening, Janet Coles is the botanist here at Olympic National Park. So
Thank you, Janet, for taking this, what do they call lifeline on the TV shows? Thank you.
Well, I'm a huge fan of Catharine Copass's work, so I could listen to your talk, Kath, a dozen times and still learn new things. Janet's called me and I'll tell you more about the white bark pine, but there's money through these, there's all this money being thrown at the Park Service these days to do things like work on white bark pine. And there's the North Cascades, Olympic, and Mount Rainier just received a grant of $350,000 to build up a seed bank of disease-resistant trees. So that's going to be happening. And most of the work's going to be happening at Mount Rainier and North Cascades, but what's going to happen at Olympic is we're going to get a much better sense of where our disease-resistant trees are to start to keep better track of those and potentially start gathering seeds and generating a seed bank of those as well.
And Janet, if you could just briefly explain to those of us, including me, who think they know what's affecting white bark pine, but maybe need a refresher.
All right. There are two things that are two diseases or two issues affecting white bark pine besides climate change and are actually exacerbated by climate change. One is a non-native disease called white pine blister rust, which is an Asian fungal disease, which has been infecting five needle pines. So western white pine, southwestern white pine, limber pine, foxtail pine, and white bark pine. Since the early part of the 20th century, I think it's when it first arrived in North America. It first was reported from Seattle, and it's been spreading from there. And it's fatal to the trees, but some trees have some natural resistance to it. So that's what the current set of surveys is trying to find, are trees that appear to have some natural resistance to that rust fungus. The other issue with white bark pine is the pine bark beetle, which has cycles of destructiveness that are related to how warm and wet the winters are. And since our winters lately are getting warmer and wetter, the beetles are becoming more of a problem. So those are the two main things that are driving white bark pine towards extinction.
Great. Thank you, Janet, for that little primer on threats to white bark pine.
Anytime.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And if there's any other questions, if you would like to go ahead and put them in the chat. Otherwise, it looks like we're coming to the end and wrapping up. There's a question here that is from Todd A, but it's not really, it's about the use of herbicides for weed control. And so not really in anyone's knowledge of that, about that. So Todd, I will try to get answer to that to you offline right there. So, all right. Everyone, thank you so much for coming out, especially you, Catherine. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us and what you've worked so many years on. It's really quite an amazing achievement. So thank you so much. For everyone here tonight, thank you for coming. And I will invite you to our last perspectives of the year on Tuesday, April 11th, I believe it is, where we'll be learning more about the invasive Asian clams that are starting to show up in some of our waterways here in Olympic National, on the Olympic Peninsula and in Olympic National Park. So thank you so much and have a great evening.